So how's it going? I wanted to hop on here and really make a really big announcement. First off, this Saturday, Obadiah's Cave Part 2 for our New Year's Eve service. It's the second year I'm doing it. This Saturday, official time, 7 o'clock. Please, if you can, please be on time. I have a whole philosophy as to how I want things to go, so that way I can give you what the Lord has given me concerning you, concerning his people, but also I want us to eat, be merry, and have fun. Ecclesiastes tells us that's part of our lot in life underneath the sun. So please be on time if you can. It's this Saturday, 7 o'clock. If you want to show up before that, just hit me up. I should be home majority of that day, but just hit me up. But the official start time is 7 o'clock. Okay, so I got probably like 4 minutes to break this down because I really don't feel like splitting these videos if I don't have to. So one thing I wanted to talk about was the prophet Samuel in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16, but first we got to make a pit stop in chapter 9. So we know that God used the prophet to anoint kings, and we see that ultimately it was God that highlighted Shaul to Shmuel. He highlighted Saul to Samuel. If you go to 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 17, and again this is a closely Hebrew translation, so I could be 1 or 2 verses off from your translation, probably just 1 verse off if any. This is God speaking to Samuel. He says, and Samuel Saul, it's easier in Hebrew, and Shmuel saw Shaul, and the Lord answered him, here is that man of whom I said to you, this one will govern my people. And so let's fast forward real quickly to 1 Samuel chapter 16, and where do we find ourselves? Verse 1, and the Lord said to Samuel, how long are you going to grieve about Saul when I have cast him aside from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have seen me among his sons a king. So there's a lot going on here. Healing is when you're submitted to the Lord, it's a continual journey. You never really reach a place of, okay, I'm good, I can stop here. When you're submitted to the Lord, there's always we're always under some kind of process. And what I think is interesting about these particular chapters, about the saga of Samuel, is the fact that it was God that highlighted Saul to Samuel, and he said, this is the one that will govern my people. And then when we fast forward, not even a full 10 chapters later, we now read about God rejecting said king, and we see, most importantly, the prophet grieving. And it's so, my question that comes to mind is, what do you do when the whole reason for our relationship, the whole inception of a relationship or a friendship, whatever, was brought about by something that God did, and now the same God that started this relationship is also the same God that ended this relationship? And so I can understand as a human having my own heartbreaks as to what Samuel was feeling. You can only imagine him sitting at home saying, God, did I really hear you? Was it really you that told me to go anoint Saul? And you chose him. The anointing was on his head. I anointed him. You chose him out of the tribe of Benjamin. He was hiding, but you called him out. I laid my hands on him. I prayed for him. I covered him. I fasted with him. I sacrificed unto you with him. And now you're telling me that you have rejected him as being king. And now we have God telling the prophet, how long are you going to grieve, saying I have rejected him? And so one of the things I would highlight or title this as is God perspectives. So yes, it was the word of the Lord that chose Saul, and one way I see this as a prophetic perspective, irrespective, and this is very important if you're called to be a prophetic anything, one of the things that's very important to know and to always have in your back pocket, in your front pocket, in your jacket pocket, always like a hat, some glasses, your hair, whatever. When you're called to be prophetic, one thing that you really need to have is the perspective of the Lord. And so, irrespective of how someone lives, how they choose to live for God or not, God still sees them. What's on them is still very much valuable, and what's upon them is still very real, whether they choose to live under the standard of God or not. So notice, even though that God does indeed reject Saul, as you continue to read the scriptures, and mostly his dealings with David, he is still referred to as the Lord's Mashiach, his anointed one, not the anointed one, because that's Jesus, but if you read it in Hebrew, Saul is referred to as an anointed one. So irrespective of the fact that he didn't decide to live up to that, David still acknowledged what was on Saul. However, there are standards to what God has called us to, and because he didn't, choose to follow the Lord, he missed out on what God had for him. And so what I find interesting is Samuel is having trouble letting go of that. And the Lord deals with him and says, how long are you going to grieve about this thing? I have rejected him. Now, the anointing is still there. That doesn't mean that Saul is less of a person. But I see it as the love of God and his love for his people, that seeing that Saul, because of his consistent disobedience, ultimately became a schizophrenic. He doesn't allow him to... he decides to not extend his reign or to extend his dynasty, but indeed it will come to an end, and he's going to raise up David. And so God speaks to Samuel and tells him to fill his horn with oil. I believe it would have been a shofar, a ram's horn, something that would have looked something like this. And he tells him to go to Yeshai, to Jesse the Bethlehemite, because he has seen for himself a king amongst his sons. Now, I love the Hebrew play on this, because that word for seen is connected to what we say, Jehovah Jireh or Adonai Yireh. So you could really see this as, because I do think that some people translate it as this, I have provided myself a king, but I like how Robert Alter says, I have seen myself a king. So the seeing of God is connected to the provision of God. If he sees a need, he is very much able to provide that need. And so what's also interesting is he doesn't even tell him which son it is. Now, again, think about Samuel from this perspective. Samuel might be a little bit hesitant, as he was, because he might be thinking, well, the last guy I anointed, ultimately disobeyed you and he left you, and now you're telling me to go anoint this Jesse, and I don't even know how many sons he has. I don't even know which son, and you're telling me that irrespective of what I just experienced, to go do the exact same thing with another family that I probably don't know. I mean, he might have known Jesse, he might have been prominent, but still, he doesn't know what son this is, and yet he's being instructed by God to go do something blindly. And so he, rightfully so, is nervous, because he says, well, if Saul finds out about this, then he's going to kill me. Wait, did he really say that? Oh, yeah. So verse 2, and Samuel said, how can I go? For should Saul hear me, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you, and you will say, to sacrifice to the Lord, I have come. And you will invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I myself shall let you know what you must do, and you will anoint for me the one that I say to you. And Samuel did what the Lord had spoken. And what I find interesting about this is, on your healing journey, oftentimes I feel like a sign, and this is for me very much so, but I feel like one of the signs of a mistrust and fear is an obsession with details. Because if I hear anything that sounds off, I'm like, I'm out. I don't want anything to do with this. And so God would have it in his wisdom, in his infinite wisdom, and his infinite sovereignty, to hide certain things from us. Because when I don't know everything, I have to rely on him. I have to believe that he's not going to do anything that would hurt me. Because, rightfully so, he's wondering if Saul would kill him if he hears about this. But in this situation, God tells him to go. So he has to believe that, God, I know you wouldn't put me in the way of death. And even if I was put in that way, you wouldn't allow that to be my end. And so, again, to reiterate, I believe where we see an obsession with details, what about this, what about this, what about that, it can be a sign of mistrust. And take that, I'm not trying to imply that, if you ever have any questions, you don't trust God. But what I'm highlighting is essentially that one way God builds trust is hiding the details, and we walk. And as we continue to walk, He reveals more. Because my movement, despite what I don't know, is connected to my trust in God. Like, again, God, you're not going to lead me to hurt me. And so he says to him, to the prophet, say that I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And I believe that all healing to some degree implies or requires some form of a sacrifice. And so the question I pose to you, could it be that there are still Davids somewhere in a field? There's someone writing songs and they're unknown because someone decided to not come out of grief, and they can only focus on what was and not focus on what the Lord wants to continuously do. Because again, irrespectively of what someone chooses to do or not to do, the Lord will continue His plans and He will continue His purposes. But we have to really ask ourselves, who is going unseen right now because they won't, or someone won't come out of grief?